Hi paper crafters, it's Olga. I'm so sorry I've been away for quite a long time. I have been visiting the UK to plan all the paper discovery releases for this year. There are so many super fun products planned, and now I can't wait to start playing with the first release this year, which is all about the water and shaker cards. I will talk you through the products really quickly, and then we are going to create some projects to demonstrate how those products actually work, because some of them do need the explanation. In this release, there are 4 large die sets, there are 3 stamp sets, 1 cut and emboss folder, 2 embossing folders, 1 large bag of sequins, and there are also 3 packs of printed vellum, which is a very new product, and I will explain about it later on. The stamps and embossing folders are A5 size, which is roughly 6 by 8 inches. There is also a sentiment stamp set as well as the bag of sequins, but those are still on their way to me, so I cannot show them to you right now, but you surely can find them at the store. The links are in the description. Now let's start with the projects, so you'll see what you actually can do with all those products. For the cards that I'll be making, I'm going to combine 2 die sets. They are Into the Pond and Elements. As you can see, the actual dies are much larger than the pictures on the packaging. Into the Pond set has 14 dies, and it's mostly the things that you can find under the water in the pond or in the fish tank, like fish, frogs, or the bridge. The Elements die set are the things that you can find on surface of the water and above it, like plants, birds, and insects. Also, all the dies fall into 2 main categories. These dies that I'm holding in my hand are the images that are viewed from above, those lily pads and fish and frogs, as if we are looking down into the pond. The other type is the view from the side, as if we are looking onto a fish tank, or we are looking at fish from under the water, or we are sitting at the bank and just looking at the lily pads and birds and plants. To create the card base, I'll be using Creative Expressions Barely Gray cardstock. It's a very nice shade of gray and it works perfectly with white. It might even look as white on the camera, but it's not. This is white, in fact. The size of the card base I need is 6.5 by 6.5 inches. Since the paper is A4 size, it's not large enough to create a card base as one piece, so I'm going to make a hinged one. I have trimmed one piece to 6.5 by 6.5, and the other one is the same size, plus it has 1/2 inch tab at the end. So I used that tab to attach 2 pieces together, and here is my card base ready. To create a shaker panel, since it's going to be a shaker card, I'm going to use a piece of watercolor paper. To create this frame, I'll be using the Pond Edge die set. It has 2 cutting dies plus 1 insert that is meant for embossing. The size of the largest die is 6 by 6 inches, and you know that large dies like these can be quite tricky to cut, but I do have a recipe how you can make it quickly and easily. To begin with, I have taped down just the insert die onto the piece of watercolor paper, and now I'm going to emboss it. So I'm building up an embossing sandwich for embossing with the die. For my large platinum machine that I'm using, it looks like this. I'm sanding it through and I get the perfect embossing, and you can even use these images on one side or the other. When I'm done with the embossing, I'm going to take the outline dies, both of them, and I'm finding the right position, since this image is quite organic and it looks differently on all four sides. Then I'm taping the dies down, and again I'm sending the dies through the machine. This time I'm building up a cutting sandwich. You can see that the cutting sandwich didn't flatten out the embossing at all. Anyway, you can always emboss it one more time if you want to, but I think it's perfect just as it is. So the reason I used watercolor for this frame is because I really want to add watercolors to it. I'm going to use wet on wet technique, so I'm applying some water all over the surface of the frame, and I'm also applying the water on the wrong side. If you apply the water on both sides, it's guaranteed that your piece of paper is not going to warp or bend as you are working. It's going to remain perfectly flat. So now I'm just picking up some of the gray color with the brush, and I'm dropping it into the small pools that are formed by the embossing. I'm using peerless watercolors here, but any watercolors would work. Just use the ones that you have at hand. I keep adding more color wherever I think I need more contrast, and then I'm going to use the heat tool to dry up all the coloring. First I'm drying the right side, and then I'm going to flip over the piece of paper, and at the wrong side I can even take off the excess water with the tissue or paper towel. Don't do it on the right side because you can lift up the color as well. When the frame is fully dry, I can start assembling the card. I used some double-sided tape to attach a piece of acetate at the wrong side of the frame. Then I have used the lily pads and lily flowers view from the top to die cut the images out of cream and white cardstock. You can see the lovely embossed details that the die adds. I'm not going to add some ink in a coloring to those images, although you can definitely do it if you want to. I'm going to shape the flowers slightly with the flower shaping tool and a mat. I have die cut 6 lily images, and each flower is going to take 2 layers, so I'm just applying the smaller layer onto the larger one to make larger flowers, and the other 2 flowers are just the smaller image. So the flowers are going to be a bit smaller correspondingly. When I have all 3 lily flowers assembled, I'm going to place the lily pads and flowers onto the pond surface, and this is what this die is. And I'm playing around, placing them wherever I want to. You can place them in the center of the pond as well as closer to the edge, just as you want them to. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to use the hot glue and stick down all the die cuts. You can totally use the foam tape, but I completely ran out of it. So instead I'm using the hot glue gun. I'm applying a large amount of glue, but I'm not pressing the die cut down too hard, and this way I'm creating some dimension. Then I'm moving on to the flowers. Again, I'm applying some glue. I'm sticking the flower down, and some glue is coming out from the center of the flower, and while it's still hot, I'm going to apply a small half pearl, and it's going to stay attached. Of course, all the tools and supplies I'm using are listed down below in the description box, as well as on my blog. To create the bottom of the pond, I'm going to use this gravel embossing folder that is also the part of the new collection. I'm placing a piece of barely gray cardstock inside the folder and I'm sending it through the die cutting machine. It creates a lovely texture that, by the way, can be used for much more than just gravel. So now to make the pattern stand out even more, I'm swiping the ink pad across the embossed surface, and the ink I'm using is Hickory Smoke Distress ink. Then I'm going to stick down this embossed piece of paper onto the card base using some double-sided tape. I'm just centering it on the card front and pressing it down. Now when I have the pond bottom and the pond surface, all there is left to do is to add some life to it. So I've die cut the koi images out of iridescent cardstock, and I'm going to find the right position to them, so I'm just playing around a little bit, and then I'm going to stick them down. As you see, for this card I'm only using the view from top type of images. To stick the fish down, I'm pressing down the tail, then I'm applying some glue onto the head, and once it's stuck, I'm also applying the glue onto the tail, and now I have the entire image attached on exactly the spot where I meant it to. Then I'm going to repeat the same process with the other fish. Before I attach the frame, I'm going to add some sequins. I'm sprinkling them right onto the card front in the center, and I'm using some neutral shade ones. They are the silver confetti as well as some iridescent ones, and some silver and black sequins as well. All of them are by Cut Scrappiness. I will link them up in the description. To attach the frame, I'm using the craft foam and some double-sided tape, since I ran out of foam tape. And now the only last touch that this card is missing is that little frog. I've die cut it out of gray cardstock, and now I'm placing it onto one of the lily pads. And here is the first card finished. You can see it has tons of dimension and texture. It has a lot of sparkle and movement, just like the real water. This is just one example of how you can use the view from the top type of images. Now we're going to create another card that is the view from the side. I'm going to use the same white and gray cardstock, but it's going to have a completely different look. I'm going to use the barely gray cardstock again to create a card base. This one is going to be just slightly smaller than 6 by 6. It's going to be 5 and 7/8 by 5 and 7/8. And this way I can use just one piece of cardstock to make this card. So I'm scoring the A4 piece of cardstock at 5 and 7/8. And then I'm placing it into the trimmer and I trim it down to 5 and 7/8. So this is my card base, and now I'm going to create a frame for it. So I'm using the pure white cardstock and I'm trimming it down to exactly the same size as my card base. Then I'm going to use a circle die. I'm taking one from the clock die set from the previous release, but you can use any other circle die that is 3 1/4 of an inch. I'm centering the die on a white panel, then I'm taping it down to prevent it from sliding to the side, and I'm going to send it through the die cutting machine. This way I'm going to have a square frame with the circle window in the center. Then I'm going to place this frame into the embossing folder. This one is from my previous Timeless collection, that's what it's called. And again, I'm sending it through the die cutting machine. By the way, guys, for those of you who asked, the clock dies are now back in stock. So now I have the pretty embossing all around the frame, and this one reminds me of textured porcelain. Then I'm applying some double-sided tape at the wrong side, and I'm going to stick down this frame onto the card base. I'm not adding any foam. I think that the embossed texture is quite enough. All there is left to do now is to create a scene using some die cuts from the latest release, and I have chosen the view from the side ones for this scene. All I'm doing is sticking them down with some liquid glue onto the gray background, and I'm not using any advanced techniques here. It's super simple, but I just love the look. So I'm sticking down the lily pads and flowers, then some rushes and a little dragonfly, and this finishes my card. This one has been super quick and super simple, but I'm simply in love with the look, this embossing and how it goes with the details on the dies. It really doesn't have to be complicated to be beautiful. Both these cards, the view from the side and the view from the top ones, are freshwater themed, but there are also some dies and stamps that are saltwater themed in the collection. So let's use some of these for the next project. For this project, I have trimmed down a piece of blue textured cardstock to 6 by 6 inches, and I trimmed down a piece of vellum, the printed one from this very release, to the similar size. You see that this vellum has the beautiful wave pattern and it has some color, but it still preserves that transparency. I'm going to place the blue cardstock inside this cut and emboss folder. You can see that there is an actual die incorporated in the folder. By the way, it is removable, so if you don't want it to cut, you can totally go for that look. So now I'm just sending it through the die cutting machine, and I'm building up the regular sandwich that I'm using for embossing with the folder. But in this case, the center comes right out, and you can see that the embossing is nice and deep. So I have created a kind of a pond with the pebble shores, and this one, by the way, works great with the stone pond die. Now I'm going to swipe some white pigment ink across the card, and this is going to make the pattern stand out more, and it's also going to add some white because you know I like the touch of white on everything. You can use this die cut as a shaker frame just like we did on the previous project. It would also be a great frame for beach photos. But this time I have decided to use this die cut in a little bit unusual way. So I'm folding it in half, and this is going to be the card base. I'm going to fold down the piece of vellum exactly the same way. I'm folding it in half using just the fingers, and this is better than using the bone folder or scoring board. You won't break the vellum this way. So now I'm applying some liquid glue at the wrong side of the embossed piece, and then I'm inserting the vellum piece into it, and I'm closing it up and sticking it down. This way my card base looks a lot like a rocky shore, and I like the fact that the water is actually semi-transparent. Again, now I just have to add some inhabitants, and I'll be using the dies from Beyond the Sea die set that it's all about the sea creatures. I have chosen the seahorse and a lobster and one of the starfish. I have layered 3 die cuts to create each of the images. This way they are going to be a bit dimensional, and because some of them are hanging off the edge of the card, I really need that extra sturdiness. I'm simply using the liquid glue and sticking down everything on top of the card base. To add the sentiment, I'm going to use Simon Says Stamp pre-printed sentiment cards. I'm going with I Wish We Were Neighbors, and I'm simply trimming out that sentiment strip from the card. I have used both the craft knife and the scissors to cut out the sentiment strip, and then I'm going to stick it down onto a piece of white cardstock, and I'm cutting it out again, and this way I'm creating that white border all around the strip. This is just another way to add more white to the project. I have attached a few foam squares at the wrong side of that strip, and now I'm placing it onto the card front. I decided to trim off one of the borders on the right, and this way I can find a perfect position for this sentiment. There is yet one more thing that should be added to this card. I have trimmed down a strip of cardstock to about 1 inch wide, and I'm sticking it down to the inside of the card, and this way I can add a stamped or written message. So now my card is completely finished. It's a bit unusual shape, and I like how it looks against the light because it makes that wave pattern stand out. So let's have another look at all 3 projects. They are the example on how you can use the dies and embossing folders from the new collection. There is yet another product that requires a lot of explanation, and it's the printed vellums, and I hope to tell you much more about it in the future video. I will be showing you a lot of techniques and explaining why you need the printed vellums. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and have a wonderful weekend.